Christina. She's going to discuss 4 keys to authentic parent engagement. She will highlight tips and strategies to promote family engagement and create a stronger home to school partnership. So thank you for joining us so much, Christina. I love it that you're here. I will hand it over to you. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you so much, Scott. I actually love his awkward introduction because it makes me feel really good. Like he really I don't know, gives a nice lead in. But if you're a Seinfeld fan, you know there's like that line from George Costanza where he wants to end on a high note. I almost feel like I should end after the introduction because it's really, really good. But I appreciate that, and I thank Kangaroo Time for inviting me. Let's see. So Scott told you everything about me. I should tell you a couple technology related things. I'm super terrible about keeping an eye on the chat. So I really appreciate that Scott and Genevieve are going to keep an eye on that for me. And I promise you that we will take any questions that you have at the end. I want to answer them. I'm really missing the face to face interactive component of trainings. I miss seeing people in person. I love that you're not zoomed out enough, that you're still participating in webinars. So I thank you for being here today. I also want to apologize if any weird technology things happen on my end. Couldn't figure out how to make my AirPods connect with my laptop. So I'm using obviously the wired headphones. And what's going to happen because I'm standing up is at some point I'm probably going to move away and my entire setup here is going to crash to the floor. I'm going to try really hard for that not to happen, but please be gracious with me if it does. Um, let's see. The other thing that I should tell you before we really dig in is that I should probably clarify that I know myself pretty well, and I'm probably going to go back and forth between saying the term parent engagement and the term family engagement. And honestly, that's just force of habit. I know, and we all should use family more than we use parent just because we know how diverse families are and we want to be really inclusive with our language. But I recognize that old habits die hard too. And I also recognize that, of course, many times the use of the word parent is still appropriate too. So that's a really long-winded way of saying that I'll be using the two terms interchangeably throughout our time together this afternoon. I was telling the team at Kangaroo Time that I opted out of sharing a PowerPoint today for 2 reasons. One is that I'm trying to get back to the style that I normally use in person. And normally in person, I don't use PowerPoint unless I really, really need to illustrate a visual that I can't convey to you otherwise. And I was really inspired by the author Mem Fox. Most of you early childhood folks will know who I'm talking about when I talk about Mem Fox, the children's author. I was privileged enough to hear her speak at a NAEYC conference, and she was the keynote, and everyone was really psyched to hear her. And when she stood up to the podium, she turned to the blank screen behind her and she said, "You'll notice that I don't have a PowerPoint." And there was this pause, and you expected an explanation about like a technology problem. And she said, "I'm going to be honest with you about the reason why. The reason is I see the power, but I don't see the point." And of course, we all laughed, but that really got me thinking about it because she explained that, she wanted it to feel like a conversation, like she was really speaking to you as an individual. And she said, "And if I invited you to my home and we were sitting at my couch or my dining room table, I would not be like presenting some slides on the side." So that's a choice. I hope it works for you. If it doesn't, I'd love to hear that later. Let me know because I'm as adaptable as I possibly can be. So if in the future, if you prefer slides, you let me know and I'll make that adaptation too. That said, don't worry, I do have handouts. I know how early childhood people feel about handouts. So I'll make sure that I share those files with Genevieve and Marissa so that they can share those in the KT Connect group or with your certificates, however they opt to share that information. So I'll be sure to do that for you. So let's get started. I feel like in order to have a really productive conversation about family engagement, for us to really dig in and discover some strategies that can elevate your current practices, I think that we have to begin with the end in mind. So what I mean by that, beginning with the end in mind, is that we have to answer a few questions and we have to dig deep for the answers. So right now, I'm going to ask you to really think about what it is that you hope to get out of family engagement. So what are the outcomes that you have in mind? And do those outcomes align with your values? That's probably the most important part of the question. What are the outcomes you have in mind when you think about family engagement? And do those outcomes align with your values? Do they reflect your core values? So at the most basic level, I'm asking you to think about, what does family engagement mean to you? Now, for clarity, I'm not talking about tasks here or events or activities. Instead, I'm asking you to sort of think about the big picture. I want you to sort of help me craft the definition. Sometimes, if I'm in a workshop or in a coaching relationship with someone, when I ask a program leader to think about what family engagement really means, I get sort of this surface level response that's basically a list of activities or a list of experiences that they've crafted for parents and families to participate in. So, for example, I'll ask, what does family engagement mean in your center? And the responses sometimes are things like parent teacher conference, open house, newsletters, daily reports, social media, all those types of examples of ways that the program communicates with parents. Now, those are all relevant strategies. I feel pretty strongly that they can be vehicles that drive engagement, and we will talk a little bit more about them later. We'll dig into some of the ways that you might need to adapt your messaging or that you might need to kick it up a notch with certain strategies, especially considering the constraints that the pandemic may have put on your program. But for right now, let's not think about those events and initiatives. Let's think big picture. What does family engagement mean to you, and to what end? So the way I think about it is this: if family engagement, if that family engagement strategy gets a permanent place on your to-do list, like it's always there, it never goes away, even though you're constantly making efforts. And not only does it get a permanent place, it gets a prominent place. It's always important. So if it's important enough to get that prominent, permanent spot on your to-do list, what are the outcomes you desire? So think about that for a second. And I seriously wish that we could take the time to unpack individual responses, um, like we would in person, because there's huge value just in the discussion, learning from each other and where other programs are coming from. But because in this context, we can't necessarily do that, I'm going to share some insight, and I'm going to hope that it's sort of food for thought for you. That's really my goal in terms of any presentation that I do, whether it's like workshop style or a webinar like this, or even if we meet one-on-one. I don't necessarily believe that educators, whether it's, teachers in the classroom or an educator in the role that I'm in right now, I don't believe that we necessarily have all of the answers. I don't think, like, that's just not the way I look at it. I don't think about, I'm carrying around this pitcher that is full of all of this knowledge and I pour little bits into your cup. That's not how I think people learn best. I think instead, if I can plant some seeds, if I can give you that food for thought, you're more likely to be able to apply what we've learned today and what I've shared with you. So in my experience, I'm going to share with you what I've heard and what I've sort of experienced in this realm of family engagement. In my experience, when people are sort of working initially to craft out the definition of what family engagement is and why it's important to them, what often ends up that they're talking about is what I'd call compliance. So they end up talking more about compliance. And in some ways that makes sense to me. What directors want, what teachers want from parents in a lot of ways is for them to cooperate. We want them to arrive on time. We want them to pay their tuition on time. We want them to show up for parent teacher conferences. And we want them to send in the diapers and send in the extra set of clothes. We want families to comply with the policies and procedures that we've communicated to them. And we do want parents to participate in all the events and initiatives that we've designed for them. So I do understand the importance of those things. In my life, I have several times been the teacher of the student who did not have the extra set of clothes. I've also been the director with a family who's late picking up again. So I do understand that compliance matters. However, and this is really like the crux of what I'd like us to think about this afternoon, compliance is not engagement. You can probably argue that it's a product of engagement. That as engagement levels increase, it's more likely that people are participatory and that they're compliant. But I'm asking you today, I'm going to encourage you just to think about this differently. Starting today, when we're talking about engagement, I'm really going to encourage you to think beyond compliance. And here's the reason why. So much like student engagement is about more than just sort of being present and following the rules, family engagement really is more than just compliance. So let's dig into that a little. You know what, I'm just going to grab a drink though, because it's 61 degrees in Buffalo today, which is basically like summer. And because it's 61 degrees, that means that the room that I'm in right now is approximately like 3,000. So if my cheeks start to get really, really red, don't panic. It's just because it's heating up in here. Try to be on top of that. But okay, so let's get into that idea. So much like student engagement is more than just being present and sort of following the rules, family engagement is about more than that too. We're all probably familiar with the term student engagement. Very popular, has become even more popular over the past several years. And that makes sense to me because we've just learned more and more about those connections between cognitive and non-cognitive factors. We know as educators that learning improves when students are interested. We know that learning improves when students are inspired. When I think about it, that's probably the definition of student engagement. You know, it's the degree of things like attention and curiosity and interest and optimism and passion that children show when they're learning or when they're being taught. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you to help me apply what we know about child engagement to that idea of family engagement. So let's talk it through. Um, Much like the desired outcome of student engagement is more than just like learning a specific skill or earning a specific test score, the desired outcome of family engagement is more than just that participation or compliance. So what you really want in terms of engagement is for families to be truly invested in your program. You want them to be in sync, you know, with your mission and with your values. You effectively want them to be your brand ambassadors. You want their levels of like attention and curiosity and passion to be sky high. You want them to be the people who are out in the community talking about what a great place this is for children, that they're so invested, not just financially, but also emotionally, that they really feel like they're part of your community. When you reach that level of authentic engagement, I promise that you do not have to worry anymore about compliance. It really naturally follows. So when you get to that point where people are truly emotionally committed, you don't have to worry so much about the showing up on time and coming to the events and bringing in the diapers. You know, that said, I'm a realist. I'm also a mom. I know that even the most engaged person will occasionally forget the diapers or they'll occasionally be late. But when they're highly engaged, that's the exception and not the rule. And honestly, when I think about it, when it happens in the context of that really authentic, positive relationship, those little things are not nearly as bothersome. It's when the relationship is absent or sort of fragmented, that's when those things, forgetting this, being late, not showing up for this, not participating, that's when those really start to like pick at you. All right, so that was a really, really long lead in, but that's basically the first key to authentic engagement, you know, to think beyond compliance and to know what's really important to you. I think it's important to mention too that this view of family engagement, the one that I'm asking you to really accept from me, the one that really relies on high levels of emotional commitment, that really nicely aligns with employee engagement strategy too. When you think about the definition of employee engagement, it's basically the extent that employees feel passionate about their work, you know, that they're committed to the organization. It's so much more than just activities or events. And that's exactly the mindset we should apply to families too. When you take this step, shifting how you think about engagement, it's a really important first step because it represents a shift in your mindset. And when your mindset shifts, your behaviors, and those behaviors later become habits, those all naturally follow. So the reason why I get started with this first key, this key to authentic engagement, starting with thinking differently, is because we have to do that work first. We have to make the mindset shift before we can start shifting behaviors. I should add too that if you're a school leader who's participating in this call, your team needs to know this too. You know, your teachers, your staff, they need to share your definition of engagement and they need to really have a good understanding of how it differs from just compliance or participation. So, just like with all things, you'll have to invest some time to help your staff buy into the idea once you buy in. So, once you do, you might want to bring it to a staff meeting when I do this type of activity or this type of topic in staff meetings, I like to lead teachers first through an exercise that focuses on values and beliefs. I do actually have a handout. It's from the McCormick Institute, which is just an amazing place in Illinois. I have a handout that works really well for that, sort of for evaluating your values and beliefs in the context of an early childhood setting. You could pretty much use it anywhere for educators. So I'll make sure that I share that with Marissa and with Jen so that they can share it with you too. But so when I lead this activity where we reflect on the values and the beliefs and the teachers really dig into what those shared values are, I then take it a step further. And I ask teachers to reflect on ways that they demonstrate those values to families. It ends up being a really complex conversation, but super thought provoking. That said, the logistics are really, really simple. I go super low tech. Basically, I just write up a small deck of little index cards and I write one belief or value on each card. So I'll have a deck of cards that say things that reflect the values of the school. Things like respect and honesty and integrity and safety, whatever your values are that you guys reflect on and come up with together or that you reaffirm together. You write those on one side of an index card. Then you make up a second stack that just has opportunities for interaction. And what I mean is like times of day, times of year that you interact with families. So those cards say things like drop off time, departure time, at open house, on a child's first day, on a child's last day. They're just really specific opportunities that people typically interact with families. So I have these two little stacks of cards. I split everybody into small groups and I give each group a stack that has both sets of cards. So when they're working together, and a small group really is best for this, each group goes through the deck and they choose one card from each stack. So they choose a value and they choose a way that they demonstrate the value, or I'm sorry, they choose an interaction. So then their task during their small group discussion is they choose a card, and then they discuss one way that they actually demonstrate that value during that interaction. It ends up being really valuable as long as you can keep the discussion on track. So you need to sometimes remind people to focus on concrete behaviors. So let me think of a perfect example or a concrete example. So for example, if I say, I demonstrate respect to families at departure times by greeting them warmly and by being careful not to rush them out the door. That's the kind of response that you're trying to generate, just because it's a little more meaningful or a little bit more specific than I demonstrate respect to families at departure times because I do respect them. I love their kids. I hear those types of responses too, and those are valid thoughts. But when we focus on the behavior, it makes more sense in this context for what you're hoping to get out of the exercise. You want to drive home the point that every single action, no matter what it is, actions either attract trust or they repel trust. And if we want families to truly be invested, to have that sort of emotional commitment that we talked about, to be engaged, to be inspired, to be passionate, to be really invested, we have to consistently behave in a way that attracts trust. So think about that for a minute. We need to consistently attract trust. All right, so that's the first key to authentic engagement, thinking beyond compliance to that place of being really invested, really engaged, really inspired, constantly attracting and building a trusting relationship. So if we've got that first key, that mindset shift already explained, we can dig into the three remaining keys. So the three remaining keys are to assume positive intent, to invest in relationships, and last but not least, because it's my personal favorite, to be it, to teach it. So next, we'll obviously focus on that second key to engagement, to assume positive intent. That's as simple as it sounds. To really believe that families want to be actively engaged, to believe that they want to care deeply about you, about your program, about your mission, about your values, about your day-to-day operations, about their child's experience, and to believe that they have the capacity to demonstrate that high level of commitment that you're looking for. So assuming positive intent, it's believing in families. It's believing that not only do they want to be as actively engaged as you want them to be, but that they have the capacity to do so too. It just might look a little differently from the way that you might expect it, because families are different. Families are diverse, right? So assuming positive intent, I really feel like it's such a powerful leadership skill overall, but it doesn't often come naturally. I found that to get good at it, we have to first sort of like do a little pre-work. We have to first recognize that all human beings have this automatic tendency to see negative intentions when something has a negative impact on us. So what that means is like we don't inherently or automatically assume positive intent. We actually assume negative intent. We assume that if this went poorly, this had a negative impact on me, the person who perpetrated that crime, they had negative intentions. So knowing that that's a natural human tendency, we have to deliberately practice looking for positive intent. We have to get past the tendency, and that requires a really intentional effort. So when you do assume positive intent, you're not only giving people the benefit of the doubt, you're giving yourself this really beautiful opportunity to learn the details of the situation. You're curious. You tend to discover sort of like the reasons behind people's actions and their choices when you're curious, when you have that positive intent. If you are willing to assume positive intent, you're more open to like learning the other person's story. And there's so much information out there about stories, about how they are just this authentic human connector, that when you learn someone's story, you're not afraid of them anymore. When you learn someone's story, you're more attracted to them in terms of like values and beliefs. Like you're just nurturing relationships more when you are open to learning stories, right? So when you're open to learning family stories, families in turn, and this makes sense, they'll tend to feel more open too. They'll be more connected to your interactions. When you give someone the benefit of the doubt, there's this bond of trust that's developed. And honestly, that's where the magic happens. All of that emotional goodness, that commitment you're looking for, the optimism and the passion and that investment, that only happens in the context of a trusting relationship. So that's key number 2. Assume positive intent. When you assume positive intent, you're letting others know that you have confidence in them. And most people will go to great lengths for someone who believes in them. If you thought about that personally right now, if you reflected on that, if I asked you to think about someone who believes in you, chances are you would do anything for that person. That's pretty much a universal experience. Most people will go to great lengths for someone who believes in them. So when you do assume positive intent, you're letting people know that you have that confidence. And that's a really important way to move forward in your relationship. You know what? This is important. I should probably point out that assuming positive intent is very different from when people say, oh, he means well. Like you've heard that, oh, he means well, or she means well. That's usually just a way to excuse bad behavior. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not suggesting that at all. Instead, in assuming positive intent and being curious about people's stories, we're actually sort of slowing down. We're asking ourselves, or we're allowing ourselves to see things through the eyes of someone else. We're opening ourselves to new perspectives. When we do that, we're reminding ourselves that there are so many reasons why a person might act a certain way. Maybe the person's going through a hard time. Maybe they just had a rough day today. Maybe they were stuck in traffic. Maybe they're sleep deprived. Maybe more significantly, that they are impacted by trauma. We don't know that, right? So when we remind ourselves that there are so many reasons why a person might behave the way that they do, instead of making a judgment about that person, we empathize. We empathize by assuming the best rather than the worst. And when we do that, we're able to build deeper relationships. We could probably talk all day about, that perspective shift and being open to different perspectives. One of my favorite activities to do as a meeting opener, and I'll share it in case you want to use it in a staff meeting, is this activity called Perspectives. And again, I'll include it in the handouts, where you just ask people a bunch of different questions. Like one of the questions, for example, is your neighbor just got a really expensive new car. How much did it cost? And you just ask people to give their immediate top of mind response. And the questions are all sort of unrelated like that. Like you go to Target to return something, and when you get there, the line is just too long. How many people are in it? Well, I ask 5 questions like that, and no matter what the group size is, there's a huge variety in the responses. And what that leads to is a discussion about the fact that we all have different perspectives. Even if we're in sort of a really homogenous group where, we all work in the same place, we're all from the same demographic area, we all have a lot of similarities, we still have all of these things that impact our perspective, the way that we were raised, what we're currently going through in our lives, any past trauma, any current ongoing health struggles, our values, our age, our generation, like all of those things impact who we are. So if we can avoid passing judgment about a person, we empathize, we assume the best, and we can build deeper relationships because we're open to more perspectives. I will sort of just share that activity with you too. It's called Perspectives. It's a meeting opener. I'll share the handout for it in case you want to run with it as well. Super easy one, but super effective. I actually worked with a school that every year they selected a theme for their professional development. And one year they had this really amazing learning experience. Their theme was assume positive intent. It was remarkable for me to see the growth there. By the end of the year, you could actually hear teachers saying things to each other like, I'm not sure it sounds like you're assuming positive intent here. Can you tell me more? Like sort of reminding people of their goals, reminding one another, supporting one another. And I even heard them self-correcting, saying things like, it was really funny. I can remember two experiences of hearing a teacher sort of telling a story in a staff meeting, in a professional development session. And she stops and she says, you know what? I'm listening to myself and I can tell I'm not doing it. I'm not assuming positive intent, am I? And she was right, but that sort of self-reflection that grew too. It was a really powerful shift. And I think that when you adopt that assume positive intent mentality, it has a really meaningful impact on all of your relationships. Most of the teachers, they shared that they had fewer issues with children's challenging behaviors too, because when we assume positive intent with children, it changes the way that adults respond to the behaviors. I loved hearing that because, as Scott mentioned, I play a role in the local behavior collaboration where our focus is just boosting social emotional competence as the means to, just like it says in the national pyramid model, boosting social emotional competence as the means to promoting positive behaviors. So that really begins from a place of assuming positive intent. I share that not because we're talking about children or behaviors today, but because I know that's the reality that we live in as educators. In my experience, when I ask teachers, what do they need more training and support on? I would say probably 75% of the time it's about challenging behaviors. So that idea of adopting assume positive intent as sort of your mantra, that can have an impact on multiple aspects of your program, your leadership capacity there. All right, so small beverage. I often wonder, I hope it's not a super loud swallow when I do that, so I apologize if it is. But that leads us to the next key to authentic engagement. So that is to invest in relationships. This is another perfect opportunity to sort of apply what you know about children to the relationships with adults. So as an educator that pretty much everything in learning and in life, it's all about relationships. That children, they do not learn from people that they do not like. That children know if an adult does not like them. And that sort of transfers over to what we know about families too. We know that families they will not make an emotional commitment to someone that they don't trust. So as I said before, that passion that you're looking for, that investment in your program, that's only going to happen in the context of a trusting relationship. So how does that look? How exactly do we invest in relationships with families? This is where a lot of those communication strategies or activities come in. The open house, the conference, the daily reports, the newsletter, those all can be investments in relationships. If you approach those tasks with intention, those can all be really valuable investments in relationships. Communication is pretty much always a critical function of leadership. It's always a vehicle that can drive engagement. In fact, when I'm asked specifically about engagement strategies, I almost always start with communication strategies. That's particularly true in a crisis. And for the record, this pandemic is still a crisis. The details of our circumstances, they differ. They differ based on where your program's located and the restrictions that you might still have in place. But regardless of where you are, the crisis has undeniably interrupted business as usual, in really significant ways. So in times like this, in these times where it's sort of prolonged uncertainty, where there are lots of changes, even sometimes where we continue to have more questions than answers, one good thing about that is that leaders can really shine with really clear communication. One of my favorite authors, Brene Brown, she says, clear is kind. And when I think about that, that resonates with me because everyone needs more kindness, right? Clear is kind. So families, they need to consistently hear from you and they need to consistently feel your presence. Intentional, clear communication, that's the way you do that. Intentional, clear communication, that's kindness. That's you extending kindness to your families and investing in that relationship. So what that communication looks like, the methods you use, that's going to vary. It's going to vary based on you, what your expertise is, what the norms are in your program. But honestly, you want to take literally every single thing that you know about relationship-based marketing and you want to kick it up here. You want to continue, you want to send the emails, you want to send the text, you want to make sure those daily reports are awesome. You want to engage on social media, you want to make the phone calls. I will reiterate that one, make the phone calls. There is something about hearing your voice, even if it's just a voicemail. Some of my favorite stories from teachers are about the ones who call home about something great. And once parents get over that initial, ooh, are you only calling because something's wrong? When they know that you have a habit of just communicating well, not just when something's wrong, they love to hear it. They love to hear about those high points in the day. That's particularly true from you. If you're the school leader, they need to hear it from you too, because they need to be invested in you as a leader. They need to trust you, right? So people, they need to see your face, they need to hear your voice, and the pandemic has probably caused some barriers there or created some barriers there. Some of the restrictions that we still have in place, they reduce the daily opportunities that used to sort of happen naturally. You know what? On that note, I was just thinking about, I was listening to a chat that Scott from Kangaroo Time had with Hani last week, and it was on the YouTube channel, so I was listening to it there. And they were having a conversation about mentorship. And in that conversation, Scott mentioned that he thought a mentor needs to be three things: a consultant, a counselor, and a cheerleader. He called it the three C's, very catchy. So he said a mentor needs to be a consultant, a counselor, and a cheerleader. I thought that was awesome because it really applies to nurturing interactions with, or nurturing relationships with families too. Families, they need you to comfortably take all three of those roles. They need you to do it. They need teachers to do it. They need you to confidently communicate your expertise, to always really carefully grow that bond of trust. That's always been true. They've always needed that from you, but it's even more important now when the sort of pandemic related barriers, they persist, right? So it's super important to use each and every communication message to remind families of what's really important, to promote that emotional connection that you're looking for, that emotional commitment. So you want to ask yourself, does your newsletter do that? Does it remind them that you're a knowledgeable and ethical leader? How about your social media posts? Does it remind them that you know them and that you care deeply about them? How about like the mandatory signs that you have to post on the door or the memos that you send home? Do those serve to remind families that they trust you, that they should trust you? So for the record, the way that you do that, the way that you sort of promote that intentional messaging there or promote that emotional commitment is you do it by committing to both beauty and excellence. You commit to both beauty and excellence in every single communication. That's another thing I learned from Brene Brown. I love it. I guess that's sort of an internal mechanism they have at her company. But basically that means beautiful presentation, positive language, and clear, concise, consistent messaging. Your effort to make it beautiful, to make it excellent, that's an investment in the relationship. That's time well spent. And you know what? Along the same lines, if you are still able to be the person who like holds the door open for a mom in the morning, or if you're the one who's at the front door doing those COVID related temperature checks, scanning the little foreheads, you want to ask too, what are you communicating to families during those routines? That's a valuable opportunity. So your body language, your tone of voice, your surroundings, your word choice, it all matters. Every interaction, it's an opportunity to make an investment in the relationship. So you want to be sure that your values are shining through. Making families feel welcome, that's the first step in helping them to feel valued and respected. So, with that in mind, I want to just briefly go over some of the activities that might be disrupted from pandemic restrictions and sort of my thoughts on that. So, things like open house or conferences, family events. Um, these activities, these events, they're obviously designed to promote engagement, but I want to sort of reassure you that they're not essential for engagement, not when your focus is on more than compliance and participation. When I was a director, and honestly, even into my first years as an administrator or I was supervising directors, I sometimes fell into that trap. I fell into the trap of equating attendance sometimes or showing up with engagement. I'd say, oh, this center, they only have this number of families turn up for their parent teacher conferences. So the families there, they must not be engaged. But that's not always true. In some circumstances, when I think about my own experience, we actually had to change our perspective. We had to change our procedures. Sometimes we were missing the mark with the timing of the conferences. Sometimes we were delivering confusing messages, but either way, we clearly weren't understanding our family's needs, so we weren't meeting them. With that specific example, with the parent teacher conferences, one of the centers that I worked with, they had this really successful experience with flipping their communication. So that's sort of like a flipped classroom. So they prepped the lesson, which in this case was like the info that they'd normally share in a conference, what they'd normally go over, work samples and information about the program, curriculum, that type of thing. So they crafted a video and they shared the video with sort of a narrated PowerPoint with families in advance. Then they marketed the in-person meeting time, the actual parent-teacher conference, as the opportunity to discuss that, to engage in the discussion with parents. So they flipped it, rather than using that time to present information to them, they used it to really engage in discussion. Super successful for them. That idea of flipping communication can be really useful overall too. Pretty much any presentation type thing that you'd be giving to parents, like a big bulk of information, if you can invite them to receive and review the information in advance, especially if you prep accordingly, making it beautiful and excellent, when you do that, you're inviting deeper conversation in person. Those parents are more likely to leave the discussion feeling heard, and they don't feel overwhelmed or underwhelmed, which sometimes parents get that vibe from a conference too. So that idea, feeling heard, that's pretty much the gold standard for relationships. You may have seen this quote. I love it. It says that being heard is so close to being loved that most people can't distinguish between the two. That to me tells me about the power of helping people feel heard. So, all right, so that's a lot to digest in regard to this idea of investing in relationships. If I had to sort of sum it up neatly, it's all about engaging in behaviors that attract trust. You want to inspire that emotional commitment that you're looking for. So to do that, you have to pay attention, prioritize beauty and excellence in all of your communications. And you might want to consider flipping some of your communications. Particularly now, as we continue to sort of navigate all these impacts of the pandemic, we have to find ways to foster connection in the absence of those typical physical interactions. So I think one way to think about that is like if you're a hugger, which I am sometimes. I guess I'm like, I don't know if it'd be a reluctant hugger. No, I guess I'm a selective hugger. But if you're a hugger, your goal is to nurture that feeling without that physical interaction, because you can't necessarily have all of that opportunity for the actual physical interaction, but you want to nurture that feeling. Okay. So that brings us to our fourth and final key to authentic engagement. This one, like I said, this is my favorite. You have to be it to teach it. You have to be it to teach it. So this one is so meaningful to me because this is really how I try to live my life, both professionally and personally. So in my work, I support school leaders and teachers with this focus on authenticity and communication. I really work hard to sort of help people hone in on how to build and maintain those positive relationships. And in doing so, I spend a lot of time talking about vulnerability and talking about courage. Most of my work days, especially the good days, they are summed up by I feel like I've just helped others to feel heard and to feel understood. In every single topic that I present, there are these recurring themes. If you were with me for the webinar I did for Kangaroo Time last year, sort of in the early stage of the pandemic about self-care, and there are recurring themes today too, being kind, choosing joy, embracing optimism, being vulnerable. Those are messages that recur in all of the work that I do because they're all just about building leadership capacity. So I'm reminded every single training I do that I'm compelled to live that message. I have to be it to teach it. You have to be kind and patient if you want to teach children about kindness and patience, right? So, along the same lines, doesn't it make sense that if you want your school community to be a community of partnerships, of people who are fair, people who are ethical, people who are self aware, well, you have to have those same qualities and you have to demonstrate those same traits. You have to be it to teach it. So, that means if you think back to that first question I asked you when we got started a little while ago, what does family engagement mean to you? What are the outcomes you desire? And what you want is passionate, inspired families, the ones who are really emotionally invested in your school. You have to demonstrate those same qualities day in and day out. Your team needs to demonstrate those same qualities day in and day out. I know that that can seem really complex, and I'll admit it's not always easy to show up as your best self. We're human. But the good news is that whatever you focus on, it grows. So if you intentionally prioritize that sort of authenticity, where you focus on optimism and positivity and your passion for your program, the growth will happen naturally. What you focus on will naturally grow. So whether you call your school, your organization like a school, a center, an academy, or any other name, there's one thing that's universally true about all of our programs. You know, it's more than just a place, it's a community. And that community is made up of sets of partnerships. Those partnerships, they will thrive when you thrive. So when you show up every day modeling the values and the behaviors that you want to see in other people, those partnerships thrive. Your school community, it thrives. If you're looking for super specific ways to do that, to embrace your authenticity, I will sort of just recap a couple of things when I wrap up in a few minutes. But in terms of authenticity specifically, my number one suggestion is always to develop a gratitude practice. That's one of those recurring themes with me. Expressing gratitude, it's always a win-win because it's a self-care strategy and it's an engagement strategy. So speaking personally, if I don't know the answer to somebody's question, I feel vulnerable. I don't like not knowing the answer. But then I connect them to someone else who does, and I have an opportunity to feel grateful. I thank the person who asked me because they trusted me with the question. And then I thank the person who does have the answer because they helped me maintain the trust. I have to remind myself to be grateful for those connections and the relationships that they help me build. And that helps me show up as my best self. There's no rules about gratitude practice, but just set aside time literally every day to say thank you. I say this so often that it's like on a little magnet on someone's fridge that I saw. So it's sort of cliched, but like having gratitude and not expressing it is like having a present and not unwrapping it. Like just do it. You can start small, just set aside 5 minutes, make a list of the people and things you're grateful for. And I will say that list, just the making the list, that's for you. Just making the list gives you this time for reflection. And I promise it fills your heart with gratitude. It's a good thing. Then you set aside another 5 minutes, and that's when you express it. You write the note, you make the phone call, you send an email, whatever you're going to do, social media shout out, whatever, just express it. Gratitude is this gift that just keeps on giving. It's always good, right? So that is my 2 cents on authentic family engagement. That's my food for thought. I really believe that when you combine those 4 ideas, when you think beyond compliance, when you assume positive intent, when you invest in relationships, and when you embrace the fact that you have to be it to teach it, you just have to, you're strengthening those partnerships in the most meaningful ways. You're going to find that emotional commitment you've been looking for if you can adapt or adopt these types of mindsets. That said, if you are the type of person who likes to leave a webinar with a nice little list of tips and tricks or specific strategies or what you can do next, these are my suggestions. First, try out that values exercise that I mentioned when I was talking about getting your staff on board with this idea of thinking beyond compliance. I'll send the handout. It's pretty easy to implement. Get started with that. Next, dig into that idea of assuming positive intent. There is so much research out there, but literally to not overwhelm yourself, just start by using those words. Use them every day. Am I assuming positive intent here? Ask yourself. It's helpful to sort of start with yourself and then start infusing it in conversations with other people because you have to be it to teach it, right? The other thing is to do a walk through your building, like literally right from the front door with the goal of asking yourself what this physical space is communicating to parents. The signs on the doors, the work that you display in the halls, it's all saying something. Is it saying what you want it to say? Ask yourself if everything is conveying and meeting that standard of beauty and excellence. Make a list of the things that don't convey beauty and excellence and don't convey your values. And then you have that quick to-do list for making some practical changes. And last but not least, don't dismiss that idea of gratitude practice. It's really one of the most meaningful changes you can make because it taps into this essential human need for recognition. Gratitude is a solid leadership strategy always because it's an investment in relationships. And I'm pretty convinced that this work, the work with children, with staff, and with families, it's all about relationships. So I hope you found value in this perspective, and I'd love to hear your questions if we have any.
Hey, Christina. Yeah. So as people are popping in questions, if they do, I love gratitude practice. We did a values exercise as a company at Kangaroo Time about 2 years ago, and it was a process of building out our mission statement. So we broke into multiple teams. We whiteboarded, and then we tried to collaborate, or we tried to amalgamize and kind of like blend all the feedback we got. And there was one resilient theme, which was kindness. Every one of us really valued working in a culture of kindness. So your gratitude practice, something that I've implemented personally, something that our company that we lead with, and we have to really evaluate and assess it and reinforce it every day, is that culture of kindness. So for me as a CEO, it's about approachability, it's about stewardship, it's about giving, it's about being present, and it's about helping people. So if I can tie back to our values of kindness and I can obsess over those, then the viral loops, that like the cascading, the benefits that you never even think of, the third tier benefits that come back to you, they're just amazing when you live them. Same with gratitude. So I love that. I loved it. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No, that's great. In each of those examples that you gave of like what you value and how you see your role as a CEO, like those are all investments in relationships. You're investing in your team, and your team in turn is investing in your customers. Like that's how that community grows, and it continues to have the vibe that you want, as opposed to just sort of growing exponentially in directions that you wish it didn't go, because you can't fake kindness. Like, you know what I mean? Like you have to actually be kind to teach kind. So I think that's great stuff. Thanks for sharing.
I see somebody here attended a Brene Brown talk, I guess. And yes, I love Brene. I heard her for the first time about 2 years ago on a podcast. And
I'm obsessed.
Who's this crazy Texan that I just love? I'm a Texan also.
Like literally within arm's reach, I have 3 of her books. Like and I send them to people because like you just can't say it better. It's awesome.
She's so great. And we tried to hire her to come and speak at our Bounce conference, but she's very, very high level. And we weren't on her list, which I totally understand. But at our Bounce conference, someday when there are thousands of attendees, we will have Brene Brown. That's my guarantee. I love her. And Christina, I'll let you introduce her. Oh,
I would love it. I would love it. That would be awesome. Excellent. I don't know. Were there any specific questions you needed me to answer? Anything that popped up in the chat? I did not keep an eye on that.
There were just a lot of affirmations, head nods. Thank you for sharing your talent with words. Christina, I second that. Every time we do something together, I get inspired, and I just value your commitment to just what I like to call righteous and beautiful content.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to share it. And thanks to everybody who gave their time. I know some of us are zoomed out at this point, so I appreciate people investing in us today. And I'll make sure that I follow up with you guys to share those resources that I mentioned as well.
Awesome. And yeah, this will live in our archive forever. Fortunately for both of us, I didn't step on my tongue like you've heard me do so many times. Say some something like halfway off color. Hey, I second that. Christina, first of all, thank you so much. We love you and we love your content. You've been such a, you know, they say Buffalo's the city of good neighbors. You are the personification of that. You've been so good to us as an organization. We feel like our partnership could not be better. And then also everybody out there, we know you're all on the comeback trail. You're all fighting through some very interesting times, and we're inspired by your resilience. And if you need us at Kangaroo Time, please reach out. If you'd like to reach out to Christina, where can everybody find you?
ChristinaFecio.com, which I will certainly make sure I share with Jen. But, you know, if you ever are like, hey, who was that girl's name? Find me on their YouTube channel, and someone at Kangaroo Time will connect you with me too.
Awesome. Love you, everybody. We will see you here very soon, I think, in next week. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.